Hello everyone, and welcome back to another episode of the Reading Party podcast with Megan and Lexie. This episode continues our season looking at stories set in the Roman Empire and its periphery. Some of the material includes themes of violence or sexual assault. It is not suitable for under 18s. We hope you have your favourite beverage and snacks ready to go, because we've got our teas and are ready to start spilling the tea on our latest ancient story.
Hello, everyone. We are going to be talking about, well, I guess in English, it's Asterix versus Caesar. Is that what it was called when you watched it?
Mm-hmm.
Okay. So I want to just caveat this for everyone before we get into it. So this is a very old film, came out in like 1985. So it's not new by any stretch of the imagination. But for those of you who don't know, I grew up bilingual, going to the French School of Chicago. And so my introduction to everything Asterix was in French. And so I have been a longtime fan of the French version of this film. And that is the version that I know and am comfortable with. So I watched that, and Megan watched the English dubbed version. So I apologize in advance if you are a little confused, because I actually don't know any of the names in English. And so I will be using a lot of French names. So I hope you'll bear with us, because yes, that might make this a little hard, but that's what's unique. So essentially, we can give some background on the actual series later, but just to recap the plot for people, this is Asterix. In French, the title translates, and Caesar's surprise, et la surprise de César. So essentially, we start with our Gaulish friends in their tiny little village. And you also get this look into Rome as gifts are being brought in to honor Julius Caesar, who is their main adversary, sort of after his Gallic conquest. And so you kind of have this split screen where you have like peaceful village, and then you have Caesar in Rome. And you see Caesar having essentially the gifts brought in, and then him saying he wants like a fabulous, like prominent party, I guess. So there's this prominent head of a gladiator school or gladiatorial school. In French, the name would be Caius Obtus. I don't know what that is in English, sorry. But essentially he appoints him sort of master of the show. And so now we kind of set the context of, okay, so now I guess Caesar is going to do something and have a triumph, but it might be a little awkward celebrating the total conquer of Gaul when the one little village of our Gaulish friends is not conquered. So then our screen splits back to the village. And so then we have this great introduction of Asterix and Obelix. Essentially, they're just kind of doing village things. And then you see this lovely young woman kind of walking around. In French, her name is Falbala. And Obelix essentially kind of falls in love with her and chases her around. And it's very cute and adorable, until you see some like blonde-headed dude come in, and she clearly is in love with him, and Obelix is very sad. And so their chief comes in and just says, well, he's the son of another chief, and they're engaged, and they're all cutesy, and they're going to get married. And then they sort of unadvisedly walk out into the forest, and you're like, oh, well, this is unwise. There's a lot of Romans, because their village is surrounded by like 5 Roman camps. And then, exactly as you would expect, the Romans see their chance. They come and they capture Falbala and Tragicomix, the boyfriend, and they are essentially taken as booty to one of the camps by one of the soldiers. In French, his name is Déturion Superbus. So it's great. They say, okay, great, you've captured them. Now they're going to want revenge. Let's ship them off quickly to Rome to be part of your triumph, Caesar. And then you can say you really have conquered everyone. So they think that's a great idea, and they ship them out of town real quick. So our Gaulish friends essentially go to this go to the camp and try to rescue them and find out that they've already been shipped off. And so then Asterix and Obelix say, you know what, we're going to go after them, we're going to find them, and we're going to bring them home. And that is essentially the story of the film. And so to try to cut this down a little bit after setting this beautiful stage for us, essentially what they do is they travel to one of, there's so many different like place names, so it's going to be a little hard, but essentially in French it's Condat, which is the gathering place for la Légion étrangère, which is the foreign legion. And so they go and they sort of join a Roman legion to try to catch up to where their friends have been captured. And so we spend a great portion of the movie sort of following their training into the Roman army. And it's hilarious because, as our Gaulish friends know, it's all ridiculous. They don't want to follow the rules. They don't want to do anything. They're like, who cares about Rome? And then if you're familiar at all with the series of comics or films, they have a magic potion from their droid, Panoramix, and so it gives them super strength. And so they kind of, whenever they get annoyed, Asterix just kind of drinks a swig from his pouch, from his gourd, and Obelix fell into the potion when he was young, so he doesn't need an extra juice up. He just has the super strength. And so it's really funny. So they kind of are chasing their friends and they don't really meet up with them. And so they kind of figure out at one point when they get to a camp in the middle of the desert that their friends have been taken to Rome. So they desert their legion and then head to Rome. And then when they're trying to figure out what's happening, they learn at some point that essentially their friends were taken to Caesar, and then he decided that Tragicomix was going to be fed to the lions in his gladiatorial arena during his triumph, and Falbala as well. But they've kind of been separated. So then our friends decide, okay, well, we have to go save them and figure out what's happening. And so they decide that the only way that they're going to enter this triumph without causing too much more of a scene, right, is they are like, we're going to become gladiators. So then they essentially join a gladiatorial school, which is super cool. And again, they don't really listen. They don't really care. They're like, just whatever gets us in. And it's very funny because Caesar is here as the sort of school master, and he's like, I must have these men because they're so strong and amazing, and they'll do wonders for me. And so everything seems to be going great until the day of. Essentially, they're thrown into the gladiatorial arena, and then they're like, okay, let's just wait until we see the lions. And then they finally meet up with their friends, and then there's this whole entertaining sort of chariot race and battle, and they end up rescuing their friends essentially. And while they can't essentially come to some sort of peace with Caesar, because that would not be accurate, even though it's kind of an inaccurate series anyway, they come to an understanding where essentially Obelix brings down the Colosseum by bumping into a column, and then the whole thing falls down. And then Caesar essentially is kind of embarrassed and is like, all right, well, clearly I'm not going to win. So he's like, if you promise to just go away, you can take them and leave. So like leave. And they're like, great. So everyone is happy. All of our friends go back. And characteristic of the series, both in the comics and the other films, they always end with like a big banquet back home in their village. And it's super, super cute. And unfortunately for Caesar, we don't really know what happens to his broken Colosseum, but we do know that our unfortunate master of ceremonies for his triumph gone wrong, Caesar, there's this big threat issued at the beginning of, if this goes badly, I will feed you to the lions. And unfortunately, he was fed to the lions. So very accurate, I suppose, in that way. So yeah, that's essentially what happened in this one, but there's probably a lot more we can get into. But Megan, for people who don't know the French names.
So Caesar is the same name. The only one I've come across so far that's different is the heroine, who is called Panacea in the English version, which for me is a little bit of an odd name. All of the others are like, what's the druid called in English? Getafix. Makes sense. He's a druid. He fixes people up, like medically or medicinally, I guess.
Oh, that is different.
Didn't make much sense to me. But no, that was a wonderful summary. I watched this morning, and I wasn't familiar with this before. I read a lot of translated Asterix comics when I was a kid, but never actually watched any of the cartoons. So this was fun. And I will say, for those considering watching, bear in mind it was made in the 80s. So some of the There are some very strong racial stereotypes that come through. There is a British, at one point, when they're training to be Roman legionaries, they are put in a group with a Spanish recruit and a British recruit. And there's one more, I can't remember him. But the Spanish guy is very stereotypically Spanish. And the English guy, his name is very long and has something to do with income taxes, which is British people. Yeah, we do the tax thing, and is very, very excited about the awful Roman food. Asterix and Obelix are not, because they are used to a diet of wild boar and delicious cheeses and, all the things you would hope for if you grew up in Gaul. And they're served this kind of green slop is really the best way I can describe it. And even Dogmatics, their dog, won't eat it. He tries it and is like, pushes it away with his paw. And then the camera cuts to this very British gentleman who's literally licking the bowl clean and saying how delicious it is. I'm like, yep. The British have the worst reputation in Europe for food, which I think is a little unfair, but also European food is very, very good. So I can't say it's entirely inaccurate. So yeah, there are some interesting stereotypes going on there, but it was a very fun movie. And it's not like when I'm watching older films, they're very, very different. There's a very different style of storytelling at play. Like there isn't so much suspense. There isn't so much, like at the beginning of Disney movies, someone always dies. And you're like, and it creates this real tension. And I have to be super careful what I show my children on the Disney Channel, because if someone dies at the beginning, they're all traumatized. Like, I have not even tried Bambi or The Lion King yet, because that will not go down well, even a little bit. We did Wall-E. Wall-E was safe because it's a happy little robot. And yeah. So older films, there isn't that gut-wrenching opening that really, I feel, in modern storytelling is almost required to persuade people to keep watching. It's a nice, like, gentle story. A pretty girl and her fiancé get kidnapped, and it's going to be fine. There's no blood. There's no, like, overt violence. I mean, having said that, Obelisk, like, punches people and they fly up in the air, but it's Obelisk. It's kind of what you expect. So, yeah, all of that is to say it's a nice kind of gentle movie with a lot of very comical moments, and Asterisk running around essentially controlling everything, and Obelix following along because this is what he does. He has no idea what's going on, and that is okay. He is very happy just to follow his friend around and punch people when required. Except in this movie, punching people is referred to as being polite to them, because Asterisk explains at the beginning to Obelisk that sometimes you have to be polite and ask questions instead of just punching Romans in the face. But then after politely asking questions several times and getting nowhere, he goes ahead and just punches someone. And Obelisk takes it to mean that this is indeed politeness, is hitting someone in the face. So throughout the movie, he asks Asterisk if he needs to be polite, if these people are friends. He's like, yeah, you be polite, please. And he hits them and they fly in the ears. Yeah, it's very amusing.
Oh, that's an interesting translation difference, though, because
how is it in French?
So it's very similar, but it's different. And I think that just both of us knowing our English words, so anyone listening, you'll have to tell us whether you agree or not that it makes a difference. But so essentially the French is, he essentially says we have to be, the word they use is agréable, which is agreeable, not polite. So he spends the movie saying, I just want them to be agreeable to what I'm asking and kind of go along with the flow. And so when Obelix comes, essentially, he starts by asking the Romans things, and when they don't tell him what he wants to know, he, in French, always asks Asterix, he says, the Roman is not being agreeable to me or with me. He says, so can I be agreeable to them? And he says, of course, go ahead. And then he says, okay, pop, and then the Roman goes flying. So I don't know. I mean, one of the things I love about translations is there a big difference between polite and agreeable?
They do occasionally, it comes through as, is this person a friend? Because Obelix is having a hard time getting his head around when they're being Roman legionaries to try and find panacea and tragicomix. They are friends with the Romans, but then when they leave, they're not friends with the Romans anymore. So he will ask, either are we being polite or is this our friend? No, we're not friends right now. Fantastic. I also found the name of the British individual. His name is Selective Employment Tax.
Oh, wow. Selective employment tax. That's, interesting. Oh, that's so funny. I mean, I don't know how much of the history behind kind of the names in the series and the creators were you aware of, Megan?
Almost nothing.
Oh, okay. So, yeah, essentially, like the series was created kind of at a time where they did want to. The entire thing is supposed to always be sort of a comedic satire almost. And a lot of like the names behind people and even down to the sort of caricatured representations, they're kind of supposed to make a statement about things, which surprised me because I knew a little bit about the history of Goscinny and Uderzo, who originally created this, I think in the 60s or 50s, 60s when they started, because they were not French. In case you were curious, it's Belgian. I mean, they spoke French, but it's Belgian, and I think that's one of the biggest misconceptions because when you think of Asterix Obelix these days, it's really easy because everyone says, "Oh, that's the French thing." When you travel to France, right outside of Paris, there's like a massive amusement park, kind of like a Disneyland thing, and it's called Parc Astérix, and so it's one of the most popular series BD bande dessinée in France, and so. Yeah, it's really interesting, but I don't think his name changes too much for the Bresson in this film particularly. I don't think his name changes between the French and the English because I don't think they even mention. They just what did he say?
Unnamed.
Braille attacks. Yeah, I mean he says something, but one of the interesting things that I really want to ask you about actually in this translation was dealing with the Breton. So in French, it's even funnier, and I do feel that with the dubbed version, they'll lose out on some of the humor because of the fact that like everyone is speaking French in the original until you get to the Breton. And he's literally just speaking English, which makes him a foreigner and different, right? So you have Asterix, Obelix, blah, 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 blah in French. Then you get to the dude, right? And he just goes, So like that scene you were describing when he's eating, everyone is going, oh, mais c'est dégueulasse, and then you literally pan over to him and he's like eating it and he's going, splendid, wonderful, amazing. And it's so funny. So I did, in my research, look up and said that like when it originally came to wanting to translate the original material into different languages, the reason it took them like 3 years to do so was because the original creators were so concerned that by translating you would lose the wordplay and a lot of the jokes because they were written very specifically as French jokes. So it relies on that French sort of comedic timing and the French wordplay. So that doesn't necessarily translate as well. And so when I read that, and then I kind of went back and watched some of these scenes a second time where I knew there's really funny French jokes, I was like, yeah, I don't know how this would translate if it's dubbed or subtitled or something. So yeah, I'm just kind of curious for the dubbed version. Did they have him have like a different English accent or was it just all English?
No, so when you're translating, humor is incredibly difficult to translate accurately and to maintain that humorous thread or whatever it is you're trying to preserve, because so much of humor is culturally based, right? If you're reading an ancient text and it's hilarious in the original, either because of the wordplay or there's some like phonetic thing going on there, which I guess is wordplay, sorry, or because you have an awareness of the cultural norms that are being subverted by the humor, you lose all of that when you translate it, obviously. So I think there is probably an awful lot lost in the English translation. Having said that, they do use very liberally different accents. So the majority of the cast, the Gauls and a lot of the Romans, have American accents. The selective income tax gentleman, the Briton, has a very, very like Queen's English British accent. He's very well spoken. So you definitely get that difference. And the Spanish recruit, it has a very strong Spanish accent. There's some Middle Eastern accents going on at one point. I think there's an Italian accent in there as well, but not all of the Romans spoke in Italian accent. So I was a bit confused about what was going on there. So you get kind of that difference, but I think you probably lose a lot in the way of wordplay.
Okay. Yeah, no, it's just something that I was kind of curious about since I don't normally talk to people who watch the dubs just because all my friends growing up, we all knew French, so we just watched the same. So it's kind of exciting to me that like I finally get to figure out, okay, so what actually is different in the translation. And the other thing that you brought up that I'm very glad that you did is the dog. So I didn't know until like last year in English, his name was Dogmatics.
What is it in French?
Idéfix. Because it's a very specific wordplay because it's a takeoff on it stands for idée fixée, which is a fixed idea. And so I kind of like that because as I was translating in my head though, when thinking about dogmatics, it kind of still works though with the wordplay because dogmatics is kind of a takeoff on like being dogmatic, right?
Mm-hmm.
And so you're like, oh, but that like a dogmatic idea is really interesting because that then could actually be quite close to a fixed idea.
Mm-hmm.
And then actually though, I like how in English it then adds on a level of wordplay because it has the word dog in it and he is a dog. So that is one of the more clever translations that I never really thought about because I never hear his English name. I'm always just like, no, he's Idéfix. He's Idéfixé. And so a lot of the French names obviously are kind of a play on of some idea. It's interesting because they're droid. I guess Getafix. I've never heard that in my life. The French is panoramix. So I was like, wait, what? So yeah, it's interesting. But then in the context of history, because this is the first time I've ever had to like watch or look at this material kind of with the historical lens on. Because normally, this was like my comfort TV, my like escape when I was little, right? So this is just like the thing you would put on because you want to laugh at a silly cartoon that has great jokes and is hilarious. And I will say the original French voice cast is so amazing. It's so incredible. I just couldn't imagine not, So I would recommend that if you are interested in watching this, for anyone listening, they do have subtitles on the French version on YouTube. So if you are interested in hearing the original voices, which are so iconic, you can still understand it if you don't want to do the dub. But having sort of analyzed it for the first time as an adult and not just watching it as a kid, did you notice, Megan, that the names for the different groups of people that are represented kind of mirror real historical names for the suffixes? So like all the Gaulish names end in ix or ix, like Asterix, Obelix, the ix endings, they were made to sort of allude to the rix, which is like a fun translation of the Latin rex. So I thought that was kind of fun.
I didn't consciously notice it, but now that you say it, there are very definite naming conventions within the world of the movie that group people by their culture. Because even though the names are largely like punny names, they're still formed around like what a layperson, like myself as a layperson, haven't studied Roman culture for a decade or so. It's kind of the Roman names sound as I would expect a Roman name to sound, but they're like punny English names with a Romanized kind of ending. And the same with the Gaulish names. Again, never studied ancient Gaul, but they don't sound Roman, but they all sound coherent and cohesive within their village. It was clever.
Yeah. So I thought it was funny because I mean, when thinking about it, they'll say there's only like two historically accurate names that they'll pull out when talking about like chieftains, right? So you have Julius Caesar. And so it's really funny because like when they're talking about Roman names, right? Like all the male Roman names end in some kind of us ending because that sort of echoes the sort of Latin nominative like male singular. So Maximus something. And the brilliance of the naming, I think that it could translate to the dubbed and other translated versions, right? It's not in this one, sadly, but like just off the top of my mind, I'll say I own the entire physical library of the Asterix comic books, all in French, of course. But so I have a large stable of them. So in like the the Asterix and the Olympics comic. There's a Roman, and his literal name it translates to Gluteus Maximus, and he is a muscly athlete, and
that's incredible.
He's literally the butt of the joke, which made me die of happiness. So it's funny to see that the male Roman names are all an us ending. And then again, with the sort of Rex or X ending for the Gauls, I think even if you haven't really studied the Gauls, we know this name from history because it's so famous. But, there's the most famous chieftain, Vercingetorix, which is so weird to say in English. I've never had to say it. I took French history growing up at a French school, so I learned all these names in French. So Vercingetorix feels a bit better, but it's in that style that our Gaulish friends have. But even looking at some of the other funny sort of wordplay names in the series, just to kind of finish out this idea, I just thought it was interesting because when you see some of these other characters, so I'll take the ones that they met when they joined the Roman Legion, like Gothic characters. A lot of their names end in ich, like IC, because there's the famous Gothic chieftains. There was Alarich, and there was Theodorich, and so I think that it's really clever to have the endings there. And the British names for the British characters usually end in ax or os. So the tax dude, it's really funny. It's really clever because they're sort of trying to model it after famous British tribal chieftains whose names ended in axe. So I was like, dude, this is so cool. And so I'm sure, if we were to try to cover more the Egyptian ones, there would be more wordplay for us to find.
No, it was done really cleverly and really thoughtfully. And I think even with the difficulties of translating from French into English, I think they obviously put a very large amount of care into trying to preserve those naming conventions. It's very well done.
Yeah. As someone who just loves linguistics but is not a formal linguist, I have to say, if that's your thing, though, this series is a gold mine for you, because you can try to find the root of every pun for every person, because their name is literally a pun on either their social role or their personality. So it's kind of fantastic. I mean, even our main characters, right? Asterix it comes from the French astérisque, right? Or an asterisk, kind of like a footnote, which kind of mirrors his small stature, because in the original development, they wanted him to be a traditional, big, burly, tough Gaulish warrior. And then a creative decision early on was no, he's got to be a little guy.
And it works. I don't know if I assume this was a deliberate decision, but it works as well if you think about the Gauls as almost like an asterisk in Roman history. They're a small minor annoyance. Asterisk himself is a small minor annoyance, but in this series, they're so big and larger than life and important. It's clever.
Right? I mean, and it's perfect because his companion, Obelix, his name is basically a takeoff of an obelisk, which is a massive, big, stubborn, strong column that is hard-headed or whatever. And this is a massive dude who, if you run into him, you just bounce off of him because he's so massive. So, I mean, it just, man, I love it. It's so great, man. It's so great.
It was really fun to watch.
So the whole tongue-in-cheek everything is great. Oh, man. Okay, I've been bringing up a lot of cool things. I want to know, what's something else that you noticed that you really love that you want to talk about?
Historically, not a whole lot, again, because it's been a minute since I looked at anything Roman, but I really enjoyed, and this is, I think, something that comes across in most of the asterisk stories, the way that their decisions seem to take them absolutely away from where they're supposed to be, but somehow circuitously they always wind back in the place that they're trying to get to. When they finally get to this African outpost where Panacea and Tragicomix had literally just escaped from, eventually they realize they're not there anymore, and they march off and get captured by the same slavers who caught Panacea and Tragicomix, and they don't actually get caught because Obelisk beats them up. But they steal the camels and get to Rome, and then people try and catch them and make them like force them into the gladiator ring for Caesar's triumphant celebration. And like as a viewer, you're watching and you know that that is exactly where Tragicomix and Panacea are. That's where the Asterisks and Obelix are trying to get to. They just don't realize it yet. And you're like, just let them catch you and you'll be fine. They don't even realize someone's trying to kidnap them, essentially. It's just the way that it's done. The kidnappers try and knock Obelix out, and he's just so impervious to harm that nothing happens, and he just wanders off. He doesn't realize someone's been beating him over the head with a giant wooden bat. But even though they don't kind of go what would be the easy route, like if they just got kidnapped, they'd be in the cells with Panacea and Tragicomix. As it is, they end up going and volunteering themselves to be gladiators so they can get into the Colosseum that people were just literally trying to throw them into. So it's all very convoluted and amusing. And I think if I was watching this with one of my 11-year-old, she'd be very frustrated that they weren't just doing what they were supposed to be doing, because then they'd be there so much faster, and she would not understand that this is actually a comedic intention or an intentional comedic route, circuitous route. But I really enjoyed that kind of, I like that comedic style, and knowing that eventually they'll wind up where they're supposed to be. It's just going to take 20 minutes longer than it would otherwise, but you get all of this interesting banter along the way, and you get all of the like the visual gags that you wouldn't necessarily have. It's like going back to Obelix being hit over the head. Like there's this Roman standing behind him, like beating him over the head with a giant wooden, I said bat, it's not really a bat, but a wooden club. And eventually the Roman knocks himself out, and Obelix is just sitting there kind of thinking about where Asterix might have gone, and then gets up and walks off, not realizing for a second that there's an unconscious Roman behind him, because he just knocked himself out on Obelix's very hard head. I enjoyed all of that, really. It's just great.
Oh, man. I mean, I definitely, like you said, I also have to brush up more on my Roman timeline, because it's been a while since I've done any of the Roman stuff. Again, yes, I did classics, but let's be honest, I really cared about the Greek stuff. So I kind of was like, I only want to take these 2 Roman classes and then promptly forget about everything. No, I'm kidding. It's just, I took like 1 Roman civ class or Roman architecture, and then most of my Roman classes were pretty upper level, like specific. And so we didn't get to go over like general timelines so much as like I had an Age of Augustus class, right? Which is like super specific. So I do have to, I will be and am pumping the books and the research for this upcoming season, because I want to be able to touch more on certain things that I know are coming. So I will hopefully have done a little more research. But I was just thinking the time that these comics are set, it's set in 50 BC, right? And so I was trying to think like, okay, so what was happening in the Roman Empire, or Republic at this point, sorry, in that year? And I was like, well, again, for the historical part of the series, it's not really accurate, because I was like, look, man, I doubt that, like, I don't think that Caesar really would have been concerning himself with Gaul at this point, because in 50 BC, I believe that this is when Rome was fighting for control of Judea. So I think their attention would have been more turned toward the Middle East. But I believe this is also the year that Caesar breaks his alliance with Pompey. And so I know that when he does that, the Senate sort of recalls him to Rome, and is like, it's like the boop on the nose for a bad cat, where you're like, no, so I don't think that there's really anything accurate about this time travel. So, because I'm trying to remember, like, I don't even remember. I really, it's kind of shameful. I really need to go back and brush up on the actual historical conquest of Gaul by the Romans. But I'm pretty sure that a lot of the Gaulish stuff, though, happened earlier. Like, I almost want to say that the Gaul stuff was in like, what, 55, 54, even 53 BC, something like that. Maybe I'm wrong. I will look that up later. But essentially, I just don't think that the timeline for real history matches up very well. So that kind of made me sad, but at the same time, you gotta pick a time in history. But also I think that the choice of era was kind of I think it was a decision made by the original creators because they just needed, when creating their original franchise, I think I read somewhere in an interview that like they essentially just needed to find a subject or time period or something with a really strong connection to French culture that would allow them to sort of look at the history of the country, but like through sort of a different lens, but that was close enough that it wouldn't completely take like France out of it. And so I think that they just decided that like the Roman colonization of Gaul was the closest, because at least then you could situate it like on the continent.
And having Caesar be the main antagonist. Most people in the Western world have heard at least of Julius Caesar. If you have someone like Mark Antony or one of the earlier or even later emperors, people don't know them so well. At least they didn't back then. You might get a different picture now. There's been a lot of historical dramas set in various stages of Roman history since the 80s. But I think having Caesar probably made a lot of sense as someone that people were familiar with and had heard of, and like fudging the history a little bit is less crucial.
Yeah, no, I think you're right in that. But, I was like, okay, that's kind of a cool tidbit. And also, I think, just to kind of come back to it, because I just find it funny, you mentioned that when they see Caesar finally in Rome, they call him Julie, right?
They walk into the Colosseum. Caesar's there. He's been threatening the head of the planning, whose name I can't remember, with being thrown to the lions if it's not a spectacular event. And all of the gladiators walk in, and the ones who know the score say, "We who are about to die salute you," as they do. And Asterix and Obelix stand there and go, "Hi, Julie." Like, oh. And Caesar says, "Julie, what is this?" And gets very, very upset.
Oh, man. See, I just find that so funny. Yeah, no, I kind of wish they did a fun play on that, because in the French they walk in and it's a very casual "Salut, Jules." So I mean, I guess if I was asked to translate red, I would just say that it would be, "Hey, what's up, Jules?" So Julie took me by surprise. I was like, whoa. So I think one of the things I want to cover, just since this is one of the rare Asterix ones where we actually get them in Rome. They don't usually go to Rome very often for anything, because most of their adventures are elsewhere in the series. But the idea that they need to go to gladiatorial school. Now, I'm a Spartacus watcher. I don't claim to be an expert on ancient gladiators, but let me tell you, I thought it was really funny and kind of just a really fun, accurate thing to put in, that like, we know that Falbala and Tragicomix are about to be fed to the lions. We know they're kind of held in the Colosseum where the slaves are kept. And I love how, rather than just being like, all right, well, we're just going to walk up on the day, bust in, and be like, we're saving our friends. I like how they did have Asterix and Obelix go through the ritual of being like, we have to join a gladiatorial school, because that's the process. Like, that's how it was done. You don't just walk in and gain access. And like, it's a very small historical thing to put in there, but like, I really appreciated it. And I just thought it was kind of a cool thing to sneak in, and and to show like, yes, they were trying to train them up and do things the right way. So, until they activate their little magic potion cheat code. But yeah, I never appreciated kind of them going through that process as much until I started learning about the ancient world and was like, oh, so even in a comic, you can't just do whatever you want within reason. Yeah. I don't know. I found that thing cool.
No, it was fun. And the way that they earlier have to join a Roman legion to gain access to the camp where Panacea and Tragicomix are being held, right? They can't just go to Africa and march in. They have to go through the process. So even though it's obviously fantasy, it's obviously very far removed from actual historical fact, they're still following a lot of the same rules that you might anticipate them following. they're not just given access to wherever they want to get access to because they happen to be the heroes of the comic.
Yeah, in things that are so kind of grossly inaccurate because they're not intended to be, whenever you do find like a cool little insert of something that actually mirrors real history, I think is what makes it even sweeter to me. Like I appreciate things a little more when I'm like, yeah, you could have just been like, this is my series, I'm going to do whatever I want. But then to include that, I was like, this is really cool.
I think this is a really nice example of something that we didn't see so much in our Egypt season, of people using the ancient world as a background, but using it responsibly and still trying to operate as far as they can within the parameters of that world. And yes, I am talking very, very much about one Wilbur Smith. And I know we had whole conversations about how that series is kind of different because it's kind of like a fantasy historical thing. I don't care. I don't give a fuck. He trampled all over not only ancient Egypt and the rest of the ancient Mediterranean, but he like tramples all over everything. This is very responsibly done historical fantasy. Well, yeah, fantasy, because you've got magic potions wandering around, ancient Gaul and people. Well, I mean, Obelisk, he's a fantasy figure in and of himself. He's like the biggest man in the whole entire world. But even within that, there are certain parameters that are being followed, parameters set largely by the ancient world that is being used as the inspiration and the setting. And I think it's very, very responsibly done. And I wanted to ask you, because we've got a few minutes, if people are interested in continuing their journey into Asterix and Obelix, do you have favorites that you'd recommend? Because like I said, this was the first movie I'd seen. I kind of want to go and watch some more now. But there are a few, I think.
Yeah, I think there's like 18 movies or something, I want to say, at this point, which is like a lot. Yeah, so I would say also, I want to caveat, because a lot of these were made back in like the 80s, it's kind of hard to find them floating around online. Like a lot, I think you have to kind of buy the DVD. I know, crazy, right? That's still a thing. But I would say,
you mean there
like,
isn't a streaming service just for Asterix and Obelix?
I think there is one, but it's only for France. So if you have like an account to a certain channel in France, like you could get all of them, but obviously we're in America, so that's not a thing. No, so yeah, I guess I should say for people who even want to watch this one that we're talking about today, it's available for free on YouTube. It's the whole film. They have the whole film in French with subtitles. They have the whole thing in English with subtitles. Now, I don't know about the English. I'm sure if I Googled around, I could find it, but I know that they put Asterix chez les Bretons, so Asterix and the Bretons, that is available for free on YouTube in its entirety in French. And I watch both of these quite often, like when I'm having a bad day. They're my comfort shows. So I'll put them on. And so I think you could probably find an English version on YouTube. I just haven't checked, but if I find it, I can drop it in the show notes or something. And then the only other one I feel like I've seen on the internet somewhere. Yes, I definitely know. I mean, I don't know where I would stream them now, but I love Asterix and Cleopatra. It's animated, but actually there are some live actions, and I believe that it's a bit different. So the original is just Asterix and Cleopatra, but I believe that the special live action is called Asterix Mission Cléopâtre. So Asterix Mission Cleopatra. If you look up the difference on Google, it'll show you. There was another one. I think there's an Asterix and Obelix versus Caesar that's live action.
I did find that.
Okay. So I do know there's an Asterix at the Olympic Games live action, but I've not seen it. Funnily enough, because they were hard to access even when I was a kid growing up, I basically grew up with these, and then both of the Cleopatras are the only films that I've really seen. But I believe, just in looking up like Asterix stuff on YouTube, like I've seen there's others. So if you type in the name of X movie, like you might find something. I think maybe even the original film, Astérix le Gaulois, just Asterix the Gaul, maybe the animated one may be up on YouTube somewhere. But I will say that as an OG fan, right, I would always recommend reading the cartoons. So, as I said, I own the whole original series, books 1 through 24, 24. No, I have 1 through 25, and then I have some of the ones that are numbered in the 30s. So the background on this, though, is that the original creators got together, obviously, and collaborated a lot. The issue was that René Goscinny, he died in like 1970 something, almost 1980. And so they only had time to collaborate on 1 through 24 and then a couple different like special editions. And then his partner, Albert Uderzo, kept going. But I think just when talking kind of to the fandom about what they think are the best stories in the series, it's the collaboration when you had the two original creators.
Yeah,
Uderzo did good work. Like I enjoy anything that comes out. I haven't read any of the newer ones that have come out. Like honestly, I haven't read anything that came out after like 2008, I think, because I think Uderzo also like died in 2010 or something. So, but I know he like handpicked people to continue the series. So I'm sure that those are good. I just don't know them, so I can't recommend. But any of the first 1 through 24 are fantastic. I love them. They're really funny. And some of the nuance that doesn't translate to the screen per se, I wanted to point out. So like one of my favorites is Asterix and Cléopâtre, because when you go to Egypt in the comic, when they meet any Egyptian characters, the bubble for dialogue, it's all hieroglyphs. So you don't understand.
Amazing.
Because it's like unintelligible to them as Gauls. So you just see them and then you'll have maybe like a little like underlined or, you know, a little asterisk kind of under it. And you just see them guessing, right? So there's this one bubble that's particularly memorable. And I did actually screenshot it and send it to a friend because I thought it was so funny. If I find it, maybe we'll put it on social so people will be able to see what I'm talking about. But essentially, like, my favorite thing is you have them in Egypt and then Obelisk is getting angry because he's like, I want to tell this Egyptian the thing that I need to tell them. And so he asked their kind of translator, how do I say this in Egyptian? So you see the translator's dialogue bubble has the perfect Egyptian. And then you see in the very next scene, in the next box, Obelisk is trying to say it, but the squiggly hieroglyphs are not perfect. And they're literally put in like stick figures to show that he's pronouncing it badly.
That's beautiful.
So funny. And like this does not translate to the screen. And that's what makes it like so funny to me. And the next bubble, right, is like this Egyptian guy being like, haha, you said it wrong. Like, I don't know what he said. So his box is some different Egyptian symbols where he's just like, I don't know. And then Obelisk just gets mad. And then the very next one is him like slapping him because he's like, well, if you don't understand me trying to say it, I'll just slap you. It's so funny. It's so funny. So I would definitely recommend Asterix and Cleopatra, which is, I believe, book number 6 in the series. I also love Asterix at the Olympic Games. It's a fantastic one. You see, they travel to Greece. So obviously, if you love Greece, they'll go to Greece. Oh man, there's too many good ones. I mean, there's like Asterix and the Giant Cauldron. I'm trying to translate these on the fly, so I normally don't stumble over the names of these books, but I'm just trying to remember, so that way it's easier. There's one where it's like Asterix in Golden Sickle, which is a really good one. There's Asterix. I think it translates to in Helvetia. I don't know. It's Chez les Helvètes in French. But that one is great because if you love cheese, they're essentially going to Helvetia, and like Obelix spends the entire book running around with a massive wheel of cheese until it's like turned into fondue, and then they run around and they're like eating fondue for a good 2 pages. And this fondue in comic book form looks so good. I'm always like, I want fondue now because this looks delicious. Because they go to like all these symposia with like a shit ton of fondue, and you're like, yes, this is what I want. And so the last one I'll mention is because the films, I've noticed, they kind of cram like 2 comics into one, because I remember when I first watched the film that we watched today, and Caesar's Surprise, it's actually 2 comic books, because if you are confused and you're like, wait, where can I find the book of the film? It doesn't exist because there's 2 different ones. So the first one about joining the Legion, there's literally Asterix le Légionnaire, or Asterix the Legionary. That's its own comic where he just joins the Legion. And then I don't remember if it's versus Caesar, with Caesar, but like it's a separate one where it's like Asterix et César. And that's the one where he like goes into Rome. And so they mashed up those two, put it into a more succinct plot, and like made it into something easier. And that's that. So those are two books that you should read if you want to get the full background of this film. And then obviously, as I was talking about it, there is a book, Asterix and the Bretons, which would be the comic mirroring the other film that is readily available on YouTube. And that also is really great and fun. There's so many good books in the series. Like, it's so hard to like not keep mentioning them. I mean, I think it's pretty apparent through this episode, but you know, I grew up with these. These were as common to me as reading like the Berenstain Bears or whatever, like, or Magic Tree House. This is just what I read. And I remember some really intense fights with friends. So we had the school library in our school. And so every Thursday or whatever, our teacher, essentially during like homeroom, would be like, okay, everyone, we're taking a quote unquote field trip to the library. And this is your time where we'll have like half an hour to go in. You'll find the books that you want to borrow, and then we'll bring them back to our class and you'll have reading time. And so I just remember we would always go up to the third floor, go to the library, and then everyone would just, it was a mad dash.
Run.
Right. Like we would sprint to the bookshelves where we knew all of these comics were. And man, they would just fly off, and you'd get your hands on like whatever 2 or 1 you could get. And then you would take them out. And then I remember we would fight because we'd be like, no, wait, I have number 4. You have number 5. I need 5. Do you want to trade? So it was great. And
that's amazing.
Oh man. Yeah, man, French school was great. I mean, it was great.
It kind of reminds me, it's a solo story rather than a group of friends. But when I got to high school, I was an avid reader as a kid, and Terry Pratchett was and is and always will be my favorite author in the world. And I got to high school and went to the library for the first time, which was already a magical experience for me. And they had like all of Terry Pratchett's books, and it was incredible. And it didn't quite compute in my brain that I could like come back. So I checked out as many as I could that day, because I was like, I have to read these right now. And no, I can't read one and return it and get another one out. I need all of these physically with me. So I just took as many as I could home with me and read them as quickly as I possibly could. And then was like, okay, well, that was amazing, but I could have saved my back a lot of trauma and just brought them home one at a time. But it was a wonderful experience. I would have fought people for those books.
Yeah, I mean, it's so funny. There's so much, I mean, dare I say it, crap on TV today that you can just watch. There's so many sort of like middling books that you're like, okay. I mean, obviously times have changed, right? You know, we didn't have all the distractions that we do now, and things weren't as readily available to stream and whatever. But definitely, I think I'm very grateful to have grown up in a time where like it was a ritual. We'd be taken to the school library. We would check out. We could get up to 5 books. You would have them for your like 2 weeks or whatever, and like you would be super happy.
So I take all of our kids to the local library. They have story times. We didn't have story times when I was a kid, at least not at my local library. But my mum used to take us after school one day a week, and it was just amazing. I would take out all of the Garfield comic books, by the way, just huge stacks of Garfield. And I remember my mother saying, Megan, you have to stretch yourself. I'm like, but I love Garfield. It's still a book. I'm still reading. So I take mine to the library for story time, and then they go and pick out whatever books they want. But at the local elementary school, they call them media classes, which is essentially they go to the library, they'll spend some time working on computer projects, and then they will check out a book, and they get that for 2 weeks. Because they are small people, they only get 1 book, which is good because we have trouble keeping track of that 1 book. We have had to pay for library books before because I have no idea. I think she ate it. I don't know where that damn book is. I think she ate it. But they really, really love it. They really enjoy choosing a book and bringing it home. And yeah, it's a wonderful thing. Books are good is the underlying theme of what we're saying. Books are good.
Books are good. And one thing I will mention, just because how can I not? When I was traveling around Europe doing my master's, I had the chance to go to Brussels. And what I didn't know is that there's a whole ass museum like for comics.
Oh,
It doesn't translate well in English, but essentially in French it's Musée de la BD, which is the Museum of the Bande Dessinée or comics. So it's essentially the comic museum. And they really go into like, yes, Belgian comics, but like they'll go into more. But like the Smurfs started there. You have a whole section on swordfish, on Asterix, Obelix. Like it's a whole ass museum where you just learn about all these cool comics. It was
sounds
honestly one of the
amazing.
coolest museums I've ever been to. And then I got into the like bookstore gift shop at the end. They had the entire collection of like every comic on display. So there was the entire Asterix collection. And believe me, I was traveling, so I could only take home like 2 books. And I was so mad
Wow.
because I was like, I want to buy the series, but I couldn't. So I was mad.
That's
But
amazing.
if you're in Belgium or going to Belgium, I would definitely make time to go visit this museum. It's so incredible. There's like a life-size version of Asterix somewhere in the museum that you can take a picture with. Like Tintin is there. You can take photos with him and Milou, his sidekick dog, which I believe is named Snowy in the English. So yeah, it's amazing and I highly recommend it. And man, I'm just gonna go watch more Asterix and try to. The only reason I can't go read a bunch of them now is because most of the collection are still back home in Chicago in storage, and I'm very sad. And shockingly, it's not easy. You cannot just go out and buy the Asterix French comics here. They're sold in very specific places, or you'll have to just like import them if you're allowed to. So yeah, condolences if you want to try to get them. Although in English, I suppose you could probably find a lot of the translated ones. That's no issue. But if you're like me and you want the
But
French
if you're
version,
looking
yeah,
for the
it's
French,
hard.
well,
It's
we
very
should
hard.
wrap up there, but this has been a delightful conversation, Lexie. Thank you so much for both suggesting Asterix and then for sharing your love with us. I really enjoyed it. I'm actually going to go and have some lunch and watch one of the other movies, I think.
Yes, you totally should. It's amazing. And for everyone who's joined us, thank you for bearing with us with the difference in names and titles and things. I hope this was not too confusing. I've tried to streamline it to make sure it was a lot of practice actually to make sure that I got some things right for you guys. But I hope that you take away that I love this material. I think Megan has become a new big fan.
Absolutely.
And definitely, I would say to everyone, go read and watch more Asterix because we could all use it in our lives.
Bye.
Bye. Hey, thanks for listening. Don't forget to leave us a review, and you can also follow us on social media at The Reading Party Podcast. If you'd like to leave us a book or movie suggestion, then email us at thereadingpartypod@gmail.com. See you next week.